Hello, I'm Dapper Dan Gavoston, and I own every issue of Amazing Spider-Man, including the annuals, which definitely count.
And I'm Mischievous Marcinacchio, and I own every issue of Amazing Spider-Man, including the annuals, but the annuals don't count.
Well, welcome everybody to a special episode of the Amazing Spider Talk, the show where two fans and collectors uncover the strange, fun, and fascinating history of the Spider-Man comic universe.
Marvel Comics has long prided itself on basing itself in the world outside your window. Unfortunately, if you look out that window today, the world you'll see is a highly divided and unsettling one, which is why Dan and I felt the utmost urgency to address the topic we're going to address today. On May 25th, Minneapolis police arrested George Floyd, a black man, for allegedly using a counterfeit $20 bill to buy cigarettes from a deli. The video of the arrest showed one of the arresting officers, Derek Chauvin, using his knees to pin Floyd by the back of his neck against the ground, while three other officers looked on. Floyd cried out that he was unable to breathe, but neither Chauvin nor the other officers changed their actions. Floyd was rendered unconscious and died. In the days following the release of the video, protests erupted across the United States, uniting around the cry, "Black Lives Matter," a movement that began in 2013 following the acquittal of George Zimmerman in the shooting death of teenager Trayvon Martin. Black Lives Matter is rooted in the idea of campaigning against violence and systemic racism towards African Americans, especially as it relates to how various police departments from across the country engage with the African American community. In some parts of the country, elements of these latest protests have escalated into violence, and rhetoric from our federal leadership has seemingly further inflamed the situation at hand rather than calm it. Frankly, the whole situation is despairing, and personally speaking, it would be nice to look outside my window right now and see a superhero that can save the day, but that's not the world we currently live in. Dan and I won't pretend that we can solve these issues over a Spider-Man podcast, but we also felt compelled to respond to the death of George Floyd and rally around Black Lives Matter in a way that was relevant while honoring the integrity of the show we created more than 7 years ago. While I'm sure some contingent of our listeners are not going to be happy that we're putting together an episode with such a political bent, but frankly, over the years at Amazing Spider Talk, we have frequently addressed the issues of race, equality, and social justice as they appeared in the pages of Spider-Man, while providing context for these stories and the times they were published in American or world history. So why should today, during a time of unprecedented sorrow and reckoning in our nation, be any different? We have entered a period in our lives where sticking to comics feels irresponsible. And if 30 plus years of fandom of The Amazing Spider-Man has taught me anything, it's that if I have even the slightest bit of power to make a difference in this world, even if that difference is just having a conversation, it is my responsibility to do just that.
And I want to echo everything Mark said, as may be typical for an episode of Amazing Spider Talk. But I'll add this. Our aim here is to listen and learn. No one person can speak for the experience of our shared humanity or even for a race of people. Comics help me learn empathy and see the humanity and shared struggles that we all experience. Heck, it's the reason we all love Spider-Man. We love the idea that Peter Parker or Spider-Man represents the so-called everyman and our shared struggles to make it through life one decision at a time and one day at a time. In that way, Spider-Man is more than a character and more than a fandom and more than a multimedia property. He represents the value of empathy, the value of trying to be a better person, the value of being responsible when you have outsized power. In a situation like this, all that is in my power is to be empathetic, to listen to those who are affected by how race is handled in America and around the world, and to help support the cause of equality and justice. So to that point, this month, Mark and I will be donating a significant portion of our Patreon funds and any of the proceeds that we've earned from this episode to the Black Lives Matter movement. In the description of the show, you'll find a link to the organization's donation page. Donations can come in the form of time, money, music playlists, and so much more. So if you find it in your heart or ability, please consider clicking on that link and helping to support a cause that we feel is important. But we aren't alone, and this isn't entirely our discussion. So we've invited on two panelists to help us discuss the topic of race in Spider-Man. First up, he's one of our most amazing friends and the former co-host of the Ultimate Spin podcast. Welcome back to the show, Brian Jacob.
Hey guys, good to be hanging out with you again. Nice to be back talking Spider-Man, and yeah, thanks for having me on.
Thanks, Brian. And in his first appearance on Amazing Spider Talk, he's a freelance writer for DCUniverse.com and the co-host of the Questions We Don't Have Answers podcast. Welcome to the show, Donovan Morgan Grant.
Hello. Thank you very much for having me, and thank you very much for deciding to bring us together for this discussion. I'm looking forward to it, and I'm appreciative of the opportunity that we're doing this tonight.
Well, thank you both for joining us. I know you're going to really contribute to this conversation in a huge way, and we're really excited to have you on. So, Mark, we've kind of assembled a list of questions that we want to use to spark conversation. Do you want to kick us off here, Mark?
Oh, sure, absolutely. All these questions are going to be directed to both of you, so just kind of jump on in, and we'll go from there. Pretty informal for the most part. But I guess to start things off, as persons of color, how have you been able to relate to mainstream superhero comics, and how has that experience evolved over the years for you?
Hmm. Brian, you want to go first?
I was just gonna say, Donovan, you want to go first? Um, that's an interesting question. Yeah, I've been reading comics for most of my 45 years, and yeah, I don't know about like relating to heroes as much, because they're growing up they're just fantastic and superhuman, and I don't know if I really related as such. Trying to imagine myself as those heroes, when it comes to like dressing up as them and seeing the costumes. Yeah, obviously most of the mainstream superheroes are white guys, right? So I think looking back and kind of thinking about it, I guess that's one of the reasons maybe I was probably drawn to Spider-Man. Just, I mean, I know we've talked about this many times, and it's a theme that has come up again and again in the storytelling, and certainly in the recent animated film. But the notion that anyone could be under that mask, and so I think that's how I, kind of found an in or a connection. And as it's evolved over the years, I think the last, I don't know, 10 plus years or so, as comic book companies have started having new characters take on the mantle, and trying to branch out a little bit and have characters of color take that on, which is a cool thing to see. But it's admittedly disheartening to see the negative reaction that can come along with that sort of thing. So there's almost a defensive feeling in a way, and a shoulder shrugging feeling, like, what else is new. So dealing with comments like, hey, get your own characters and stuff like that, and kind of missing the point in a lot of ways. But yeah, I'm sorry that's not the most smooth answer, but yeah, that's a tough question, but hopefully that made some sort of sense. I don't know, Donovan, what do you think?
Um, Honestly, like how I relate to comic book characters was kind of just I enjoyed them, and I felt like I related to them. I felt like I related to Peter Parker. Um, it was a new dimension opened up to me in sort of my coming of age when Miles Morales was created, because I was really excited for the idea and the response that it kind of birthed forth from other longtime Spider-Man fans, and how a lot of vitriol came out of it. Um, Really kind of made me take a second look at this sort of pop culture community that I thought was very welcoming to diversity because of the long history of certain characters and the enjoyment of certain characters. I soon understood that it was only the enjoyment of certain characters and in certain roles, and the discourse over Miles Morales genuinely was sort of my sort of awakening in terms of applying diversity to superheroes. And so I've since thought about characters in different ways and thought about them in different kind of avenues politically, and how they resonate like when they're first created and how they resonate now. And I've started, I mean, I since have then written about them. I've written about Sam Wilson, Captain America. I've written about obviously Miles Morales. I say obviously. Well, I have written about Miles Morales and Peter Parker, and I think now my relation currently, as of like right this moment, is how they relate to criminal justice or interacting with crime, or how they present storytelling that can be found the genre of like crime fighting and the action genre in terms of how that can be politically radicalized or how that can be utilized by people with certain agendas, and how that can be told how that can be used to tell positive stories. So it's I think in the last 10 years it's been radically shifting from just I like these characters and these characters feel like me, um, to some people they shouldn't, and so I've had to think about that, and I have been thinking about that every second of my life. So
That's really interesting. So taking this kind of like a broad view of superheroes in general, I'm curious. Obviously you both have an affinity towards Spider-Man. Brian, you had a podcast, and Donovan, you've been on many Spider-Man podcasts and written about the character extensively. Do you guys feel like Spider-Man, himself has been an accurate reflection of the world he was created in, like the character and how he's been presented in media?
you're asking if he accurately represents like a young person, like a person who deals with the real world. Is that what you're kind of approaching?
Yeah, yeah, because right. So Marvel's just the world outside your window, right? Do you feel like that's a true statement?
I think sometimes it is. I think that like particularly when it comes to like things like healthcare and income, not to just checklist certain political topics, but like I think there are ways which he can do, and then some ways which I think is a little like it can be a little cloying when Peter is given all these problems, and a lot of it is presented as a result of his own lack of interest in certain areas of his life, where some people don't have the luxury of driving their interest towards other things. So I think it kind of goes back and forth depending on the writer, depending on the editor, depending on the era. I think generally, honestly, I think it's generally inconsistent. And I feel that like a lot of people enjoy a sort of underdog, underclass Spider-Man, but he's not always that bad off. Which doesn't mean that he always has to be like homeless, like in like the late '90s or whatever. But like, um, I think there are times where it can be laid on a little thick, and when that happens, it doesn't ring as true as you might like it to.
I mean, what about even just
Yeah,
how?
yeah. I don't know
Sorry,
if I'd have. I was
sorry.
gonna say,
I've
I
been
don't know.
trying to go, Brian. I'm sorry.
No, sorry about that. No, I was just actually just gonna pipe in and say, like, I think that actually like sums it up really well. And I guess it also depends on where you're at as an individual, right, and where you're kind of coming to the story. If you're looking for something to connect to, and you yourself are an underdog type character, you're having a tough time. In the kind of pantheon of superheroes, it is a little bit of a change to see someone else that's struggling a bit, and depending on what sort of era or, time period of Peter's life you're looking at, if he's got money problems or school, trying to catch up on homework and you can relate to that. Or if you're looking for escapism and he's got his own company and he's a global super spy agent, I guess it's also like what you're bringing to the table as a reader.
I mean, what about even just, kind of going back to this, the world outside your window thing? I mean, even just the environment that Peter is placed in. I mean, the fact that, I mean, it's very specific that he's in Queens. Now, granted, this was Queens in the 1960s, but I mean, Queens is still one of the most culturally diverse areas of the world. And I mean, do you feel like that's reflected in the books? I mean, what's your take on that?
Well, gosh, I mean, again, it's one of those things where I'm trying to think of off the top of my head how many non-white characters are there in the pantheon of Peter Parker's supporting cast, because he's probably one of the best supporting casts in comics. But when I think of characters that aren't Flash Thompson or Gwen Stacy, it's like, all right, you have Randy Robertson, Joe Robertson, Josh, for all of you Top of Time fans. You have Shashan, You have Philip Chang way later in like the graduate school days. You have much later in like the Horizon Labs days where you had I don't even remember those characters' names, like Sajani and Watu. Um, is that it? Honestly, is that really it?
Might
Oh,
be
Glory
close to
Grant
it.
too. Yeah, Glory Grant too.
I mean, did you say Hobie?
Oh, who?
Hobie
Oh,
Brown?
That's
Brown.
yeah, that's right. Hobie Brown, who kind of comes and goes. I mean, he was introduced. He came back later on, and during the Stanley run. After that, after the Stanley run, when did he come back? It was in the 90s, was it?
I mean, most recently he was in that slot era, the volume 5 or 4 of the book. But yeah, I think he was briefly there in the 90s. And in Paul Jenkins' run, I feel like he played a major role. Weren't they roommates then?
I thought he was with Randy then.
Sorry, that's what I mean, Randy. Am I mixing
Okay.
people up? Oh, Hobie. I'm mixing Hobie up with Randy. See, now
Yeah,
I'm
no,
making the mistake.
yeah, no, but yeah, I think Hobie mostly was kind of sidelined. I mean, he might show up here and there, but I mean, he was mostly sidelined until the Dan Slott run with Parker Industries, right? I mean, so that was, but yeah, I mean, the point being, it's not a terribly diverse cast, as great as the cast as it is, and that's always kind of struck me as odd. I mean, especially when you like compare it to the recent MCU movies, which I feel like certainly get the the diversity of just the school he's in. I feel more on the mark.
Yeah, and I would agree because like especially in New York, and that was always kind of like not to turn it towards Miles so quickly, but when people were saying, how can you have a half Latino, half black character, and it's like it's New York.
Yeah.
Like, do you know what New York is? That's the thing that happens in New York, as opposed to 1962 New York.
Do you guys feel like there are moments that stand out to you in the history of Spider-Man comics where, Stan Lee writing the book, there was always a kind of like feature on social justice or equality kind of in the background in some ways. Do you feel like there are some moments that stand out as like a really good representation of that? Or like moments where you feel like they really mishandled race and equality within the pages of these books? I'm sure you can make a whole list. Let's start with the good.
I know. Well, yeah, no, I can actually list this because I wrote about it when I was lamenting way back when Sam Wilson was first Captain America. He had that, I believe it was the Rick Remender run where he was just fighting monsters, and I felt it was a missed opportunity. I mentioned the Tableau of Time arc where you have like that kind of the protests going on, and you have the character Josh, who's because like when they introduced Randy, they immediately contrasted him with another black student named Josh, who was much more of a characteristically radical character. He was calling Peter Whitey and stuff, much to a lot of hilarity. And like the issue, like they were protesting because like I think that like their rent was hiked up or something like that. So it wasn't that intense, but it was Stanley kind of dipping his toe into like unbalanced campus that can kind of be seen aesthetically racial. But there's dialogue in there between intergenerational black representation, because you've already introduced Robbie Robertson, and when you're introducing Randy, and Randy, this is incredible. Like he accuses his father of being a sellout because he works for Jameson, and he's like, I got to live down you working for the white establishment. You don't understand what's going on right now, and Robbie's coming right back on him and said, but no, I'm trying to fight for what we're all fighting for, and like. This kind of continues for a few issues. And, you can say a lot of things about Stan Lee. Many people have. But I do believe he was genuinely putting forth real black representation with real concerns and real fears and worries on how the future of black Americans would be in the 60s. There's a later issue where Randy talks about dropping out of college, and Robbie's against it, and he says like listen, you have all this opportunity to gain knowledge, and we're in a war against want and need, and without knowledge you're a soldier unarmed. And Randy says, okay, but what about all the brothers who did it your way, who got their sheepskins, and they still can't get out from under? What do you have to say to that? And Robbie doesn't have an answer to that. And so those are very fleeting moments, but they really do speak to, I think, some of the best writing Stanley had in ways that didn't involve Spider-Man or the Sinister Six. And they're fleeting because the book's not about them. But I do think that that was actually really, really great stuff that I appreciate that he'd written into it.
Yeah, I was thinking about after Gwen's dad dies and this guy is running for district attorney, Sam Bullitt, and he's making his campaign about he's gonna stop Spider-Man because Spider-Man is responsible for this horrible crime, and Jameson is all over it, like this is awesome and we're gonna endorse him, and Robbie has issues with it, because Bullitt is positioning himself as a law and order candidate, and that's a phrase that's come into the national conversation as of late, thanks to our commander-in-chief. But it's interesting because this is Amazing Spider-Man, I think 90 and 91, so like end of 1970, beginning of 1971. And Jameson is like, well, what's wrong with Law and Order? We need to go back to the good old days, and that's how things were a lot better then. And Robbie throws it right back at him. He's like, for you, I mean, the good old days, Law and Order to me is like lynch mobs and bread lines and Uncle Toms and all kinds of awful things. And as the story goes on, Robbie does all this work and finds out that the guy Bullitt is being backed by all these hate groups. And Jameson, there's a great scene where Jameson basically calls the guy into the office to pull the endorsement. And the guy, the language is pretty, I guess, rough and blunt for that time period. But makes it clear that he's clearly a racist, and he's got issues with Robbie, and he tries to push back on Robbie, and Jameson's not having it. And it was kind of a cool scene because it's like, yeah, Jameson hates Spider-Man, but no matter what, racist Law and Order politician, he's not going to stand for that. And so they kick him out of the office. And that was kind of that's neat to see. And it's fascinating to me that was, 1970, like almost like, it's like 50 years ago. And so today when you hear, the critique of like, oh, why do we have to deal with all these, social justice issues in my comics? Why can't it go back to, the quote, the good old days like it was? Like, they were always doing this. And so that was a moment that stood out to me. And just one other quick thing, the wedding. And I love that Mary Jane's dress was designed by an actual designer, Willie Smith, a gay black fashion designer, a real person. And that was just like a matter-of-fact part of the story. And I love that. And I believe, sadly, he passed away, I think, before the issue even came out. But that was like a little like cool thing that stood out to me, even back then.
Right. I can also think of some bad moments.
Yeah. So let's go into it. Yeah.
Well, just two moments I can recall, and these weren't in my. I kind of read people talking about this later on. The Sin Eater storyline. It's a favorite amongst a lot of readers. Pretty iconic Death of Gene Wolfe. It's pretty conservative, and in a lot of that ways, it's kind of harmless racially in terms of like okay, Spider-Man just wants to get the Sin Eater. There's a lot of like by any means necessary, and you even see Charles Bronson in the panel. But there's like this character that's like this black priest character, and I think he's talking to Jameson, and there's a line about how even he was bigoted or in his youth or whatever, and he had to kind of see the light or whatever. And the whole thing it's a little broad, and I don't expect people to immediately agree, but like the whole thing kind of reads rather fraught when it comes to like because like there's this whole thing about like police justice and justice against fighting crime and how do you interface with criminals, and Daredevil is trying to fight on the side of leniency, not so much leniency, but not as crazy as Spider-Man is. Spider-Man's pretty angry in that story. Actually, it's actually difficult to articulate. There's an article on the Middle Spaces that gets into that by Osvaldo Oyola. This is really good. That can express it much better than I can. But I also remember, I believe this is during the Miles Morales Spider-Man title when he came into the 616 Marvel Universe after Secret War, where there was a scene of like this like YouTube blogger or vlogger.
Oh dear God.
Talking about like his suit got torn. It's like, oh, Spider-Man's a person of color. This is great. And Miles was feeling some type of way about it. He was like, I don't want to be like bandied about like this. I don't want to be like represented in a way which I feel like some sort of like, I don't know, some sort of unicorn or whatever. Which I thought was, now that necessarily isn't bad. But I do remember people saying, where does Brian Michael Bendis get off writing what a black person feels about representing his race? And it's one of those things that is complicated. It's not, racist or bad. It's not like, the thing that sunk the character, but it's complicated because he's actually gotten a lot of heat over just kind of telling the stories that he probably shouldn't be telling from his perspective. And I think that was also an interesting vector into the conversation of black superheroes and how they are represented, because on the one hand, I read that and felt like he felt like I don't want to be kind of bandied about as some sort of like sparkling thing for people to look up to when they don't really know me. But on the other hand, it's like, well, would I feel that way in that instance? And who is bald old Bendis to say whether I would feel or not? Of course, I'm not Miles Morales, but those are two instances that were a little spikier that I can remember in recent memory.
I always felt that moment was just very super meta, but maybe not in the best way. You know what I mean? Like he's trying to make a commentary, but it's like, well, wait, are you actually making that argument or casting down those that say it's only there because of that? You know what I mean? It kind of created this weird kind of circular logic that I think kind of, I don't know, undid the general maybe better intent of it, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
I have so much I could say about that. I don't want to take up the whole show though, but yeah. But if I could just put this out there with regards to that. So yeah, I was really excited by that moment because it was the first time after how many issues that it seemed like they were actually going to get into race. Like the idea of Miles was great and exciting and new, and it caused a lot of real world conversation and even some controversy in some circles. But for the most part, Bendis just seemed to want to treat him as just a regular kid. And so by the time they got to the run that Donovan was talking about and the costume gets torn and it becomes a thing, and then Miles pushes back on that. And I wrote about it at the time for your website, and then even talked about it on Ultimate Spin. I related to that because I kind of grew up being, a minority in the Midwest, and I was a novelty in a lot of ways, and I didn't want to be. And Toni Morrison had this great saying, this great quote, paraphrasing, but it's basically, in this country, being American means being white, and everybody else has to hyphenate. And that's what I felt, like, I don't want that. I just want to be me. I'm just a person. I don't want to be the, brown kid in the class or, Indian American or whatever it is. And, so what Miles was saying is like, I don't want to be the line is like, I don't want to be the Black Spider-Man. I just want to be Spider-Man. It's like, yeah, I get it. And then I thought that was such like interesting, complicated territory to get in. And to Donovan's point, it's also like, yeah, Bendis taking this on. I don't have a bad word at all to say about Brian Michael Bendis. I got to cross paths with him a couple of times, got to interview him for our show. Easily one of the like nicest, kindest, most sincere, genuine, sweetest people you could hope to meet. But taking on a topic like this, it's a tricky tightrope to walk, and I don't think he quite got there because that storyline did not go anywhere, and I was so, pardon me, I was so pissed off when it got to, I think it's like issue 8, where like that whole little seed, that little seeded arc, like that thread never goes anywhere, and then he suddenly has to kind of wrap things up because he's going to jump into Civil War II with the great image of, Miles killing Captain America, thanks, and hands up in front of the White House, awesome. But the whole storyline is wrapped up with like Luke Cage and Jessica Jones, and like Luke Cage has to have this kind of older, black guy moment with the young black superhero, and he says, "You're the Black Spider-Man," and he says like, "Don't screw it up." What does that mean? Like, what? I mean, I don't expect a whole like nuanced treatise on race and identity in a $3.99 comic book. I don't. But that was such a botched opportunity, and it felt like such a slap in the face. That one, like, that really pissed me off.
Okay. Well, I mean, to that point, I mean, since we're talking about Miles here, I mean, obviously, going back to his creation, I mean, this was, a cultural milestone for both Spider-Man and Marvel and comics as a whole. But there are some that kind of, I feel, relegate Miles's defining characteristics to basically boiling down to the color of his skin. And I guess, I don't know, do you find that kind of characterizing to be problematic in any way? I mean, do you feel that this is something that could lead to claims of tokenism in any way? I guess, how do you navigate with that?
I wouldn't say that he's a token because he has his own title, and he always has. It's not like he's part of a team. Like, it's not like his first appearance was in the Champions and he's the Black Spider-Man. Um, I do think it can be difficult to immediately characterize him aside from because if he's not the Black Spider, if he's not the Black Spider-Man, he's the young Spider-Man. He's younger than Peter was when he got bitten by a spider. I think that how I tend to characterize him, because I have seen and own Enter the Spider-Verse. I followed Miles. I think I've followed Miles consistently since he first came out. I don't think I've ever just dropped his book. And I think how I characterize him is how he, as a new young hero, constantly takes to falling into the shoes of Spider-Man. Spider-Man, who's always had a very infrequently enjoyed reputation. This new person, it's not even so much if he can live up to the name of Spider-Man, but if he can live up to the responsibility that his powers are now just bestowed upon him. And he takes to it differently. He doesn't freak out as much as Peter did, but he also has needs that are germane to his own life, which you might imagine from different kinds of characters and different kinds of legacy characters. But I think that his anxiety kind of stepping into that legacy helps characterize him. Signify him is him being the young Black Spider-Man, which in many ways I find to be a much more relevant character. I love Peter Parker. He is. I always say that Peter Parker Spider-Man is my favorite character on the days that Batman is not. So it's like any day of the week. But but I love Miles. But I would be lying if I said that you can characterize Miles by this, and not just mention either his stingers or that he can turn invincible. But which isn't to say that he's a weak character. I just think that I suppose an argument could be made for that, but I don't feel that way because I feel that he is a character I can enjoy and know how he would respond to certain things. I don't know. I guess it's as I'm saying it now, it's difficult because I don't want to disregard people's criticism of how he's been characterized as a potentially token character, because I don't think that he is. I don't think that he's been written that way. I think that all the writers who've written him have cared about him. But on the other hand, I think that there is a bit of complacency when it comes to introducing this character. Okay, now what do you do with him? Well, they brought him into the main universe. Well, now what? What does that mean exactly? And I think that was actually a big letdown because after being brought into the main Marvel universe, he's hardly interacted with Peter. Yeah, Slott had him in an issue or two, but like generally speaking, it's like, wouldn't Peter invest more time into this guy because he's been where he has been, and wouldn't that itself give different experiences between a white Spider-Man and a black Spider-Man through contrast and comparison? I think there's a lot more to do with Miles. I really enjoy him as a character, but I think that he's not peaked in terms of his character potential, and some of that can be racial.
Do you believe that it's
Yeah.
been a missed opportunity? Sorry, I'm cutting you off.
That's okay. I was just gonna say, like, I love the the notion of the character of Miles, and I've been like a big fan of that and a champion for that. And Dan, you and I have talked about it. Like, it seems like it took a long time to ever kind of get to know him as a character and realize him as an individual, because he was the Black Spider-Man or the Young Spider-Man, or just even worse, like the other Spider-Man. Like, we already have one, especially with the 616 merger. But like, we've talked about it. Like, how would you, like, it was a real struggle. Like, if you go reread some of the earlier stories, like, how would you define Miles without talking about his powers? Like, what are his interests? What is he into? What does he like to do? How are things going for him in school? His other classmates. And Bendis really, like, he had him hanging out with Genki, and that was it. And just like things about his identity were just kind of like were strange in some points, like a case in point. And I believe this is like Bendis being completely naive and accidentally just kind of blundering into this. But Miles's dad's name is Jefferson Davis. And you should look that up if you don't know who that is, because, Jefferson Davis was the president of the Confederate States, and a big, like, what parent would name their kid that? So that I think that was just, again, it's like, if, you're writing what you know, but if there are things you don't know, it's going to come out in weird ways. So trying to figure out who Miles is as a character, when the first relaunch happened in the Ultimate universe, like kind of the last gasp for those series, like right away Peter Parker comes back. So like, you can't even launch him in his own book without comparing him to the original. And we went through several issues of that before Miles had to sort of earn his title again. And then they bring him into the 616, and the first series is like, what do you call it? Like Blackheart and a bunch of like superheroes that are all knocked out, and Peter Parker's Spider-Man yelling at Miles like, well, what did you do? You screwed that up. And that's like, again, like the constant comparison and not letting the character stand on his own for so long. He's constantly in his shadow. So it's like, he's not getting the chance. He's always held back in his own book, which just struck me as really weird and odd and unfortunate. It wasn't a good optic, and frustrating for me as a reader.
Do you believe that it's been a missed opportunity for Marvel that until recently there was never a woman or a person of color who was the main scripter for like a major Spider-Man title? I mean, I guess the Miles Morales book that's going on right now is really kind of the one major exception to that rule.
I remember
Eve Ewing did Marvel Team Up, didn't she? She wrote Peter and like.
That is true.
I
That was
remember,
a 6-issue arc.
Brian Edward Hill, I think, wrote an annual, and I actually had somebody come to me and slide in my DMs and say, "Hey, a lot of people are happy that like Brian Edward Hill's the first Black writer to write Miles. Is that racist towards white people?" And I was like, "No, man. Look." But I mean, I think that like Black characters need Black writers at least once. I don't care, because you have a lot of great writers do justice to characters of color. You have Tony Isabella on Black Lightning, Don McGregor on Black Panther. Greg Rucka on Renee Montoya and Gotham Central. But at the same time, it helps to have somebody who knows what they're talking about, that can grant a level of just not miss anything and not come off as like performative in a way. It's just kind of easier to kind of presume that. But which isn't to say that like all like black writers and black characters can do great things. That's not true at all either. But like, there's no wrong way to like have a black character on a black writer on a character.
I mean, I was gonna say.
Sorry, Mark. I just wanted to add. I don't know if you guys have ever read this. I grabbed it off my shelf. I don't know if it's showing up, but the novel Miles Morales, Spider-Man by Jason Reynolds. If you haven't read this, read it. This was an incredible opportunity, and I think it just got understandably overshadowed by Miles's kind of wider launch to the public consciousness with the Spider-Verse movie. But this book, I loved the hell out of this book. It filled all the gaps for me. Everything that I was missing in what Bendis was doing with the character. Jason Reynolds did an incredible job of fleshing out Miles and his world and his supporting cast, and dove deep into life as a black Latino kid living in Brooklyn, and life at Visions Academy, and his social circle, and dating and race and identity, and it leans really well into those notions, especially of race and identity. And the book is written in a way that it doesn't conflict with any sort of established comic book continuity. So there's no references to Peter Parker as Spider-Man. There's no references to the Avengers. So they could all like be floating around in the background. That's fine. This is Miles in Brooklyn. I highly recommend the book. You could read it in like a day or over a weekend. It takes this character and just makes him a real person, a real individual. Jason, I believe, wrote like a short story, I think, for an annual or something like that. I would love it if he could come back and write for Miles in the comics properly someday.
Now, Brian, I have that book, and I liked it all right, but like he's hardly Spider-Man in that book. Like he suits up once, then at the end, but like most of it's just kind of like him trying not to use his powers and get caught throughout school. I mean, I was a little surprised. I was like, "Where's Spider-Man?" Did you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think to me it's like there's some cool action scenes for sure, but there's action scenes for Miles out of costume, and they're actually quite funny. Some of them, in a way, like using his powers in interesting situations. He gets Genki ropes him into a pickup basketball game that goes a little wrong, and he's got to use his powers to get out of that situation. And there's a fight or two that happens, but to me it's like the name of the book was Miles Morales Spider-Man, and even this beautiful cover by Kadir Nelson, it's about the kid underneath the mask. I mean, even the image is the mask pulled up, and understanding this character as an individual that's not. He doesn't need to be compared. He's not Peter Parker, and that's the whole point. But he is Spider-Man, and all those, the core concepts of power and responsibility. They're there, and they're woven throughout the book, not just as a superhero, but as a student, at a prestigious school, and the opportunities that come with that, and the responsibility that comes with that, being part of a family, and how expectations of him as a son. And there are some other things that happen for him in the story that kind of test those notions. I thought he did a beautiful job with the character. And so, yeah, no, I get your point about the Spider-Man stuff, but when I, went to this novel, it's like, how many times can I see Miles zap someone in a Bendis comic, right? Like, I get it, or punch someone out, I wanted to know the person behind the mask. And I think, it's such a great interesting story and a well crafted piece for the character, and it just got lost, in kind of the ocean of media that we our current media environment that we live in. But if anyone is checking this out, listening or watching, I'm just going to recommend it. Like, I think it's absolutely worth your time.
I was shocked, but it was an interesting read. I did enjoy it.
So, that's a really modern piece of writing, from a black writer. I'm curious, like, I think about, like, Jerry Conway's original run in the comics where he depicts black people, and the language he uses is really inelegant. And, Jerry has apologized for that. And I think, has made amends, as time is, and as he's grown up. How do you guys approach reading like some of that old material, and you get to it and like, what is the feeling you get when you read something like that?
I was deeply, deeply offended. No, it's honestly, it's funny. Like, I really do genuinely enjoy like the early Joe and Randy Robertson stuff. But like, whenever I read Josh and he just like hauls off and calls people whitey all the time, I just laugh. And like, it's not that like people didn't do that, but like, it's like, because if you read the sequence of events, like Peter is just like, I don't know, this is such a good idea, Josh, and he just like just yells at him. And I remember, because Conway did not create the rocket racer, right? Wasn't that like Len Wein or?
Yeah, it was Len Wein. Yeah, Len Wein and Len and then later Marv Wolfman worked on him a bit. So
I remember, I was a teenager when I first, because I used to my education came from the essentials. I gobbled all those essentials up. So when I first got to like the rocket racer, I remember there's a cop in the car described like, oh, there's a youth on a motor powered like skateboard, and they called him like a negroid, and I was like, I'd never heard that before.
yeah,
Wow. like I guess he looks like a robot, but like that was surprising. I mean, I don't really, I don't know, like it doesn't offend me because it's just the way of the times. Like when Sam Bullitt, starts calling Robbie names and stuff. I mean, he doesn't use the N-word, but like, he calls him like Sam. He's saying that to be offensive, and Jameson reacts accordingly. So like, there are definitely times where like the depictions of the characters can be a bit dicey or problematic, but like, I think that's kind of the extent of it. I don't know if I can read old Spider-Man comics and be offended, because it's not like I'm reading like, it's not like when you read Golden Age DC stuff. Like if you read like Captain Marvel or / Shazam, there's literal monstrous minstrels in those comic books. And if you read like, any old, where like the comics are kind of anthology titles, you would have like, these crazed depictions of Africans and stuff. Whereas the 60s, they were a bit better with that. And even if they were kind of misguided in terms of how the dialect would come off, or even characters like Luke Cage, who I've always been a little uncomfortable with originally, I know it's the way of the times back then. I know it was an effort to kind of put something forward rather than be entirely cynical with that character. I mean, Night Thrasher's another character, but like by and large, I think there was a stronger effort in the 60s and 70s than there might have been in the late 80s or something.
anything to add, Brian?
It's really of its time, so I just look at it like that, and I can just roll my eyes. It's just cartoonish, and writers just emulating what they it's a caricature in a lot of ways, and so I just take it for what it is. I think we've come a little bit farther since then, so I don't really think twice about it. And the fact that he's apologized, I mean, that people can grow and change, and that's what counts.
So not to jump around our media a bit, but around the time of the casting of Spider-Man in the MCU, Donald Glover, of course, floated the idea of performing as Spider-Man in the new movie, which kind of led to this conversation about race-blind casting in regards to Spider-Man, which then, of course, led to a bit of a furor online, as these things tend to do. So, there was a whole camp of people that seemed to suggest that they just wanted to see the character as had always been presented in the pages of the comic. So I guess, the question is, do you feel like race is a core element in the character of Peter Parker?
I think it
I do
depends
not.
on.
Oh.
I'm sorry, I'll go quick. I think it kind of depends on how you kind of come at the stories. If you write Peter Parker as black, then the loss of a father figure means that much more to him psychologically, and how people react to Spider-Man has a kind of a double entendre racially. Like, do they know that he's black? Do they presume that he's black? Like, have people ever presumed that Spider-Man is black? Like, oh, he's a menace, he must be black. Is Flash Thompson white, and does he treat Peter differently for certain darker reasons? Or if he's white, how does his white privilege affect other characters? I mean, is he always trying to mean well, or does he have innate biases that might come out when he is fighting the Rocket Racer? I think there are both ways to play it. Some characters can be race changed as long as you don't do that colorblindedly. Some characters can't. Like, you would never presume to change. It's like the most pernicious argument is, why can't we have a white Black Panther? Why can't we have a white Luke Cage? And it's like, you're really not engaging with the subject matter in any sort of thoughtful way. You're just doing that. You're just saying that to win an argument. Because I remember thinking when the argument of Miles Morales came out, and people start talking about like race bending characters, I really had to think, like, what if my favorites had changed race? Like, what if there was a black Tim Drake, for instance? And I said, yeah, that would trip me up, because that's not how I came into knowing the character, which I think is human nature. That's different than what I know. But if it was the same character, just kind of changed, I would like to think I could acclimate to that just fine. I mean, I remember someone getting a quote from Stan Lee when Michael B. Jordan was cast as Johnny Storm, and he said that it was all right with him. But I think someone threw that same question at him towards Spider-Man. He says, "Oh, I think Spider-Man could stay the way he originally was," which told me that, like, Stan Lee will say whatever people tell him to say. But like, personally, for me, I think if it's done thoughtfully, then it can be done well. But you got to have come at it with a thesis and not just a random idea.
I think those are all excellent points. I think I was, like, my gut level reaction to Mark's question about it, like, when it comes to like casting in the film, like, I really didn't see an issue with it, because you mentioned, Johnny Storm in the Fantastic Four movie, but it's nothing new, right? I mean, there was that awful Ben Affleck Daredevil movie, but like Michael Clark Duncan was the Kingpin. You had Man of Steel, and what's his name? Lawrence Fishburne was Perry White. And way back in the 60s, when Adam West and Burt Ward were climbing up walls as Batman and Robin, like, Eartha Kitt was Catwoman. And the world didn't end. So, I've never really seen an issue with that sort of thing. Like, I know there was, certain corners of fandom that got a little bent out of shape with, MJ in the current MCU Spider-Man series. I thought it was cool. Like, it didn't really bug me at all. What did bug me was appropriating Bendis's character and renaming him Ned Leeds. But what are you gonna do? Oh, that's another Bendis name thing I just want to mention. When I was actually speaking with Jason Reynolds, he pointed out that Genki is not actually a name. That's not a name. Like, Bendis just made that up. And when we talked to Bendis said he got it from his daughter. His daughter in like preschool or whatever would always talk about this kid Genki in her class. Genki, 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 Genki. And Jason Reynolds figured out, like, no, it's Japanese. Genki, Genki. But Bendis just... Yeah, so Bendis has always... No, it's Genki. But then, like, Gank, like, that's... There's actually a whole thing in the novel about names. But Genki's like, I don't even know what this means. Like, how the hell did they come up with this?
So taking a hard swing in another direction, I guess, and more towards kind of current events, there's this notion of the fascism of superhero comics. the idea that superheroes present the idea of this like Uberman, a person with gifts who can take the law into his own hands, whether for the causes of like social justice in some places, personal revenge, or flights of fantasy. Do you think the growing interest in superhero stories has led to adverse effects, including perhaps the perversion of vigilante justice?
I I think about that a lot because when you think about the average action story, the average superhero story, there's a lot of there's a lot of glass breaking, there's a lot of punching, there's a lot of bones breaking, and there's a lot of bravado over that. It's like I don't know. It's like whenever heroes are mad, uh, it's like when heroes like, oh, hold on, you're going too far. It's like it's more than they deserve. And it's like they get to say that because they're the protagonist of the story. That's not cause to like say you're a maniac, um, and you're carried through that line of thinking because they are the protagonist of the story and because of the traditions of action storytelling. But lately, it's just like um, I find it to be rather nefarious to get all nerdy about it in a way because I, there doesn't seem to be a lot of thoughtful responsibility in kind of portraying how. Of course, this is like fictional storytelling, so none of this is real. But I think a lot of one thing we talk about on my podcast Q&A is that like culture doesn't create society because society creates a culture, but culture reinforces society. So if people think that like vigilante justice, if they tacitly agree that it's illegal, they can still say that like, well, okay, but like the certain circumstances demand it. Gotham is messed up. That's why Batman must be a cause to intercept. But does that mean like actually breaking people's bones? Does that actually mean like putting people in the hospital? Does that actually mean like inflicting violence with abandon? Um, and I think with Spider-Man's not really a violent character, but he has had every like 10 stories. There's something where he gets mad and starts just wrecking the place up, and we know that he's just knocking them unconscious. He's not really killing anybody, but like there is the idea that like a man who can like press 15 tons when he tries is really going off, and that's something that's never really investigated. Not that we need some sort of maudlin story where Peters feels bad all the time about that, but there doesn't really seem to be a balance in that, and I honestly think that's a real problem. I think that you do need a consistent morality with superhero characters because superhero characters are essentially police. They are. They go after criminals. They investigate criminals. They break laws to stop who they deem to be criminal. They go into other countries and other places to do what they think is right. They always combat efforts to limit their power. They try to do the right thing, but the right thing is always subjective to them. Now that's the sort of the agreement we have with superhero stories, but it does reflect into people's real life politics. Honestly, you see people going off with their right to bear arms and their right to do what they feel is necessary, and it always conflicts with people who are more vulnerable. It always conflicts with people who have a different standard of understanding, and that can lead to violence, or that does lead to violence. I'm not saying that somebody's going to read a Marvel comic book and then go off and hurt somebody necessarily, but people really rationalize violence through, I think, media that they're used to, media that doesn't think that a certain violence in a certain context can be rationalized. And a lot of this can become more complex. And I'm not necessarily saying that video games are the cause of school shootings, or Commando is the cause for like or terrorists or whatever precisely. But I mean, think about it. I mean, people will talk about like the if you compare like oh, you can't show like sexuality, but you can show all this kind of violence. Okay, well that is an argument to show more sexuality. But think about the kind of violence that we do show. Like what consequence does that carry? Because you can't just say none. That doesn't make any sense. Things have consequences, whether they're they're neutral or not. So I'm thinking more these days, because you see people rationalizing what happened to George Floyd. Like just today, I was told that Candace Owens kind of went off saying, "Oh, he has his criminal background 6 years ago, and he did this," trying to make sense of the fact that it's a good thing that he died, because if he broke the law, then that necessitates a death sentence, which is severely messed up, because that's not how human beings operate outside of like the natural order. You just don't kill somebody just because they went against something that we already agreed we shouldn't do. If a kid steps out of line in school, you don't bodily harm the child. You don't kill the child as a result of how the rules go. So I think that comic books and superhero storytelling could be more responsible. They could be more thoughtful going into the future, and I'd like to think they would be. I think as of right now, I'm not trying to suggest that they're part of the problem, but they're part of a culture of media violence that has just not really thought about what it means when they depict that kind of violence. It's not been very considerate, and I think it could help a hell of a lot if they started to be.
Yeah,
you even see police officers. Sorry.
Yeah, I wonder if we're going to say the same thing, actually, because I was thinking about what's going on right now with tensions escalating between citizens and law enforcement, and just thinking about heroes and vigilante justice and people like a lot of white people that brazenly just openly carrying weapons like assault rifles and just like kind of standing on patrol. They're not law enforcement officers, but there's a fascinating and unsettling fascination with the character of the Punisher. And you see that logo a lot on shirts and, stickers on vehicles and things like that. And it's strange because that's a character I enjoyed reading as a kid. And now that logo just makes me really tense and uncomfortable when you see it kind of out in public. Like, always smile at someone wearing a Spider-Man shirt or, Batman shirt or whatever. But like the Punisher logo, to me, has become something a lot more sinister and aggressive, and just unsettling and uncomfortable. That's one character I can think of in particular. Sorry, Dan, I don't know if that's where you were going when you were starting to talk about police.
Yep.
Okay, you nailed it.
Well, I want to try and end this on a somewhat uplifting, I don't want to say uplifting note, but try and give us an opportunity to kind of get out of the realm of fascism. In times of great uncertainty and despair, like of which we are currently living in, I mean, are there any lessons that you feel you have gleaned or can glean from the pages of Spider-Man that maybe could either bring comfort or just kind of inspire, or just things that you kind of go to the well for, I guess, when things kind of get dark like this?
I think a lot about power and responsibility. I think about that all the time, and how that translates to privilege and the position that we all happen to find ourselves in. I think about that, and I think about just Peter Parker as a person, or Spider-Man. Like, everyone has a story, and so we'll read these stories or watch them, and really get into them and think about them. We can do a lot more of that with the people around us. I think there's we might be a little bit behind on the, a little late getting started, but get started. And just, we're having conversations like this, and there's so much out there to learn from. And, maybe just an extension of that, we read these stories, we can do a lot of reading. Yeah, it's great to talk with people. But people who, kind of live these realities, it's exhausting. It is so draining to walk through life and know that your life is not entirely yours, And it's as exhausting as that is, it is exhausting to have to explain that to people, even well-intentioned people who genuinely want to know. So I would say, when it comes to, taking positive lessons out of, power and responsibility, like if you're in a position, like you can educate yourself. So, we were talking about some Black writers that have, written for Marvel, for Spider-Man, so we mentioned Jason Reynolds. Pick up his book All American Boys that he co-wrote with Brendan Keeley, or his book Long Way Down. We mentioned e-viewing. Check out Ghosts in the Schoolyard about the school system in Chicago, or her book of poetry Electric Arches. I don't think we mentioned Ta-Nehisi Coates, who's obviously writing Black Panther and Captain America, but absolutely, if you haven't already, please read Between the World and Me. And these are, kind of younger Black writers, incredibly powerful voices, speaking to the moment. That's a helpful perspective that I think, like, we have the power to access that information. We have the responsibility to do that. Like, we can have all the conversations we want, but, it's on us to get educated. So that's, and I mean that in a positive way. So I hope that's of some help.
Could you repeat the question one last time?
Yeah, just in terms of, in times like this, are there any lessons that you find yourself leaning on from the pages of Spider-Man, or just, points of inspiration, things you can kind of glean to kind of get you through, go to the well for, I guess?
I think just the perennial lesson of not don't ever give up. Don't give up. But Peter Parker's had some horrible things happen to him. I'm thinking particularly like anything that's happened during the Paul Jenkins run. Remember when he thought that his neck was snapped and he was paralyzed? Remember when Norman Osborn, brainwashed him and he was like in a closet for like 2 weeks? And I love that. I love Paul Jenkins run. But not to give up. I believe there's a quote from, I don't remember what issue this is from, but I believe I read this from a Spider-Man comic, where he said, it's like, nuts to this. I've had obstacles all my life and I've beaten them all. I hope that's Spider-Man and not Hawkeye or something. But I go back to that. It's like, you have to meet this, that quote from the Master Plan arc, where he's like, you got to meet this challenge, or otherwise you have to rise up to the power that you've inherited, otherwise you don't deserve it. And that can become down to your voice and your education. If you know things that people don't that can help, you must express yourself and get that education out there. You have to. I'm finding that education is a big factor in why so many people are misinformed, and that leads to bad morality. But I think that, like, power and responsibility is such a terrific phrase for a character to be about, that he can't go away from that. I don't care who plays him in the movie. And that's one that I think us Spider-Man fans, we have to hold ourselves to that mark, and try to live that way. We might be angry about the marriage, but at least we're not hurting people over it. So let's not give up on this, on what we're going for, even if it seems impossible, like stopping racism and stopping police brutality, even if it means abolishing the police industry itself. As long as it saves lives, if it has to be done, we'll figure out a way. We need to figure out a way to do it. As crazy as it sounds, because that's something that that's a task that's brought to us that we have to do. We recognize that is kind of put over our heads, like machinery in ASM 33. So I try to think about it that way.
Excellent. Well, unfortunately, it is that time for all the good things to come to an end. So we want to say thank you to you, the listeners and viewers, for tuning into this episode of the Amazing Spider Talk. And of course, a very extra special thank you to Brian Jacobs and Donovan Morgan Grant for joining us to talk about this important topic. And now if you guys want to plug anything of your own, by all means, have at it.
I am on Questions We Don't Have Answers. I co-run that with my partner in rhyme, Harrison Chute. And that podcast is essentially social political. We talk a lot about like things that we deem important, be that like politics and society, race often, and in the future, and gender a lot as well. Even though we're two allegedly heterosexual men, but because we're both nerds, he kind of comes a lot of his perspective from a sci-fi fan, and I kind of come at it from a comic book fan. So we often mention things like comic books, or I do, science fiction, movies, certain media properties. And I think we've been doing a pretty good job. You can find us at kinoanswers.com. And as also mentioned, I also am a writer on the DC Universe website. You can find my stuff under news. Just look for my name. And also, I should still mention that, like past, but I also am still part of the Batman Universe website, where you can see me writing reviews and editorials. And I've been an infrequent guest on the Backward Oracle Barbara Gordon podcast, hosted by Stella, because she's finally gotten into the Cassandra Cain series. So check me out there. And thank you very much, everybody. I really appreciated the opportunity. So thanks again.
No problem. Brian, what about yourself?
Yeah, I'm just going to echo that. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of the conversation. And Donovan, it was great to meet you and chat comics and life stuff with you. So I'm not actively working on any projects right now, but for 4 years, I did run a podcast all about Miles Morales and Spider-Gwen called Ultimate Spin. You can just search Ultimate Spin on all the good podcast services. We're still there. Our archives are up, including interviews with the creators, including Bendis and Jason Reynolds. And you can also find that at ultimatespinpodcast.com. And if you want to follow me on social media, you can find me on Twitter at project_37.
Obviously, I want to say thank you again to both of you, and to echo your plugs, because Donovan, I've listened to many episodes of your show and really enjoyed it. And Brian, obviously, I listened to all the episodes of your show, Ultimate Spin, and even if you're not reading the comics anymore, like Brian's interviews with creators are amongst the best that I've ever heard. So I can't help but plug his show over and over again. The previous sister show or brother show to the Amazing Spider Talk. So thank you guys both for coming on the show. This is a great conversation, I felt. As always, this episode was edited by Rick Coast with production support from Andy Myers. Our artwork comes handcrafted by artists Ron Friend, Sal Buscema, and Ray Sumser. Our theme songs were produced by Rylan Bojack and Spider Madge, and our animated introduction was created by Josh Sutton of the Panels to Pixels YouTube show.
So if you missed out on our live stream, be sure to check it out in 2 weeks. And don't forget, as soon as the show ends, the conversation continues with our audience on YouTube.
So until Robbie Robertson follows in Jonah's footsteps and becomes the mayor of New York City, finally kicking the Kingpin out of office and restoring peace and prosperity to the fictional city of Marvel's New York, what's our motto, Mark?
With great podcasts, there must also come the Amazing Spider Talk.
Have a good night, everybody.
Good night.
Goodbye.
Too many who know the angles, uncover and untangle all the questions and the webs left out to tangle. Be in 1962, last Wednesday's afternoon, they'll bend your ears with reckless self-abandon. The amazing